Greetings and welcome back to our series on the parables of Jesus. Parables are earthly stories with heavenly meanings. They're simple stories that are designed to teach a moral or a spiritual lesson. Many of the parables or the stories that were taught were very simple, believable stories that could have been observed by anyone. Jesus used them to demonstrate a point, and who knows, maybe if somebody came across a similar set of circumstances, they might be reminded of the Christian principles that Jesus taught. However, there are some stories that are so outrageous that there is probably no way that people could imagine these things happening. However, even these outlandish stories were considered parables because they have a lesson. They teach a message, maybe even in an odd or maybe even a weird way. And that's the setting for the parable we're going to look at in this lesson. Once again, as we open up this study, we're going to go back to the Sermon on the Mount. It's early in Jesus' ministry. Maybe even it's the first major interaction or introduction that he's had with people. But he's having a tremendous impact on this group. He's dealing with everything from relying on God to changing hearts to finding comfort in God's power and presence. The people were being flabbergasted by what they heard. They were being inspired by the way that Jesus taught as well as the message that he presented. Now, in the midst of this message, he tells a story that has become a staple in today's world. In fact, it's so common, even in the secular world, that the oddness of the story is often overlooked because its point is so poignant. It's accepted at face value. But on that day, I wonder how the imagery may have been interpreted. Let's take a look at the parable of the log and the splinter that are found in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. Jesus teaches, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Now, let's take a look at the story that Jesus just told. Jesus tells the story of two men who meet one day. One man has a speck or maybe a splinter or even a bit of sawdust in his eye. The other has a piece of lumber coming out of his eye. In an odd twist of events, it's the man with the lumber in his eye that points out the problem the other guy has. In fact, he asks the other guy if he can help him remove the obstruction. Now again, imagine the scene. Here's a guy with a 2x4 offering to help somebody remove a small piece of sawdust from the guy's eye. That sounds odd, doesn't it? But Jesus indicates that it's a common issue. Jesus had prefaced this story with the caution, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you." No, he's not referencing eye care. He's making a spiritual statement. In essence, he's saying clean up your own life before you criticize others. Now, what's the message? What is Jesus trying to get across? Well, let's take a look at it from two perspectives. Number one, what was Jesus trying to tell the people of his day? I think he's very simply trying to teach those who want to be his disciples that they need to do some house cleaning before they begin critiquing other people. Before they find fault in others, they need to examine their own lives. Interestingly, I think he takes it one step further. He wasn't necessarily telling them to clean up their lives so they could criticize others. Rather, he seems to be teaching them also about gentleness. Even those who were living righteous lives should be cautious in pointing out other people's flaws. They needed to keep in mind that the way they would be assessed would have a direct correlation to how they assessed other people. I believe this warning is not only thrown out there just so people will, again, try to clean up their lives first and then go out and butcher other people. I think that Jesus is reminding them that as we go out and as we interact with people, not only are they watching, but so is God. While this is a parable, there's a real life story that demonstrates this point very well. It's typically referred to as the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery in John chapter 8. The religious leaders were anxious to see how Jesus would respond to sin, so they brought him a woman who had committed a sin that was not only a spiritual sin, but also a moral indiscretion. Then they offered up a solution. She should be stoned. Jesus told them something interesting, though. He said, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to cast or to throw a stone at her." In other words, Jesus indicated that they needed to analyze their own lives before trying to crush someone else's life. If these men really cared about this woman, Jesus wouldn't have had to point this out to them, but it's obvious that they didn't. They were more interested in taking advantage of her situation and criticizing her for it than they were in trying to help her out. And again, I think this is a real-life example of what Jesus is trying to teach in a rather odd story a little bit earlier in his ministry. Jesus indicated that what they really needed to do was to examine their lives. And this would be a stalwart of Christians. Many people, especially Jews, struggled with spiritual arrogance. Jesus wasn't going to allow this to happen among his people. His disciples were to be introspective and gentle. Now, what can this teach us today? 2,000 years later, how can this very odd story have an impact on us? I really believe that this story, like so many others, really like all of Jesus' parables, speak to us today. It's easy to be critical of others without paying too much attention to the issues that are going on in our lives. The sins of others are crystal clear, but we need to make sure that we're not overlooking our own faults. We're more than happy to tell others what's wrong in their lives, but we need to be reminded to look in the mirror before we look in someone else's eye. I don't think Jesus was teaching that we shouldn't call a sin a sin. I don't think that's what this concept of judgment is all about. Rather, I think he's talking about how we go about doing it. As we look at this, I think there are two issues at hand. Number one, hypocrisy. When we go out looking for the faults of others without considering our own issues, we're guilty of hypocrisy. It's one thing to notice someone else's issue. It's a question of whether we're hunting for it. And if we're out there hunting for somebody else's problems, what are we doing with ours? If we don't take care of our cleaning, and we go out and we try to criticize, we critique, we label someone else, it's called hypocrisy, and Jesus wasn't going to stand for it. I think a second thing that we can learn from this parable is that we need to be helpful. Jesus said, don't be a hypocrite, be a help. When we see someone else in trouble, is our goal to lift them up or to tear them down? Once we get our lives in order, we're going to be a lot better about being able to help others and do the right thing by them. As we look back at this really odd story about a man who has a 2x4 coming out of his head, we need to remember Jesus' point. As we look at one another, what are we seeing to do? Are we trying to help or are we trying to hurt? let's keep in mind that we're going to get what we give. It's kind of like forgiveness. I think both with people and with God, they are more apt to be understanding and kind to us if we offer that to others. Our lives on earth and in eternity will be better when we focus on kindness rather than criticism. Now some thought and discussion questions. Number 1, what does it mean to judge others? Number 2, what is the spiritual log in our lives? Number 3, do people seem to be hypercritical of us? If so, is it because we're quick to criticize others?